My name is Ram. I'm a security solutions architect at AWS. My background is applied math and cryptography, and I focus on specifically on data protection problems as I work with a lot of customers who actually deploy their architectures on AWS. So today, in this fireside chat, we are joined by Adam. He's the founder and CTO of Ionic Security. Adam, thanks for joining us tonight.
I've spent more than half my life building, designing, and reverse engineering internet-connected systems of all shapes and sizes. If your background's applied mathematics and cryptography, a lot of my background's systems engineering and cryptanalysis, protocol analysis, and things like that. I'm a high school opt-out. So I withdrew my junior year of high school because I had a software company in the online gaming space that was taking a lot of my time and going kind of a direction that was promising. So I withdrew and knock on wood, I never went back. So especially in gaming, I built a lot of plugins for other games to do things. What that gave me a kind of firsthand awareness was that while a lot of the security technologies and methodologies for keeping the systems themselves safe were decent, if I could get the information out of the system, none of those things were relevant anymore. And so it really led me to have an awareness that the applications and the infrastructure might have a level of security that's pretty good, but my information as it goes from one application and one infrastructure provider to another is going to have inconsistent security. And I really wanted to get my hands around that problem and find a way to separate the security and accountability of how data is handled from the security and accountability of how an application or an infrastructure that's processing the data is handled.
So how were you actually selected for the Forbes 30 and under 30?
Really is a black box.
Is that something you just walk up there, or how did that happen?
Oh, we got a phone call from the then editor of Forbes, Alan. I think he's still the editor of Forbes. Really just saying, hey, we've gone through a list of several hundred founders in the space. Your name keeps coming up. We'd be very interested. We did a kind of a background interview with them, and at some point they came back and said, hey, you made the list. Here's kind of what's going on, and here's what it means. And then 2 years later, they asked me to be involved on the selection process for the other. And really it is, there were some amazing folks. The year I did it, it was two of the kind of most prominent ROI-based enterprise software VCs in the world that were kind of my co-panelists for that year. And I mean, we reviewed close to 700, if I remember correctly, startups and their founders, whether they be the CEOs or CTOs, for enterprise tech. And I mean, we had a healthy debate. We kind of did our 3 to 5 ratings, and then ultimately that got munged down to a short list that the editors at Forbes finally kind of selected from. So that was my experience on the panel side. What it was like 2 years prior when we got selected, I literally got a phone call.
Perhaps you can tell us about the inspiration and a brief startup journey.
We spend most of our time providing data security and data trust technologies to some of the world's most recognized and attacked organizations, from Goldman Sachs to the Department of Defense and everything in between. Rewind 8 years ago, Ionic was called Social Fortress. And it was a small web browser plugin that gave me the ability to encrypt all of my posts from messages to photos before they actually made their way to Facebook. And kind of the reverse was true. It allowed my friends with that same plugin to be able to see the unencrypted version so long as they were actually my friend. And in between those 2 points, Facebook and anybody they chose to propagate my post to without my consent couldn't see anything. It was gibberish, basically, ciphertext. That's where it all started, and really led me to that was back going to 2010 now. I was spending a lot of time on the road. I was using Facebook to keep in touch with a lot of friends, and every couple of weeks, people I did not know commented on some activity I chose to share through Facebook. And they were always friends of friends, and no matter what I did in the settings, it always, a few weeks later, would start to expand back out in who had access to see what I was doing. It just seemed really weird. I grew up in a military family, and in our family, trust had nothing to do, and privacy had nothing to do with hiding something. It was about something that was earned, and it was something that was an invitation to have a more intimate understanding of my life or somebody else's. That was how trust and privacy really were. And in our country here in the US, if I took a photo from some trip we were on and I printed it out, and on the back of it I go, "Hey Rom, that was a great trip, look forward to the next one," and I put it in the mail and I mailed it to you, if anybody between you or me looked at that, it's a felony. If I put that same photo on Facebook as a private message and I comment the same thing to you and Facebook decides to give that to some developer through an API, it's a business with no recourse. Same intent between you and me, different medium. The laws just haven't really progressed. And so I really felt, based off my experience on the RE side and kind of just Zuck's experience of changing the privacy settings and their efficacy week over week for a while there, I just woke up one morning and fed up, realized that no matter what controls an application gives me over how it handles my data, they are all proxies to an actual control. They have my data, they got it in plain text. No matter what contract I have with them today, if they change their mind tomorrow, I have no recourse. And so I wanted to do something about that. Fast forward to today, we provide those capabilities to very large multinational organizations because it costs a lot to do that well. Come to find out, we pivoted from consumer to enterprise just really due to the level of depth that was required. And now, today, we have the ability to bring those capabilities that we spent close to $200 million developing over the last 8 years to the hands of every developer. So in a few lines of code, you can have the same data security capabilities that a company like PwC or a company like SunTrust or what have you use in your application for your customers. And that's taken a lot of work. But that really was our inspiration. And we're really excited about what developers can do now that these primitives are cost-effective and simple to access.
One thing I want to ask you is that, trust plays a major factor in building relationships within security. So in the early Ionic days, when Ionic did not have a lot of brand awareness, how are you able to earn and maintain trust with prospective customers?
Ultimately, in the early days of a startup, especially when it's one or two people, and you've decided to quit what you were doing and focus on this full time, and you're taking no salary and you're really kind of all in. The one thing you have that most other organizations don't have at that point is time. And you have complete authority and agency over how you spend that time. And when you are building something that is a shift in not just the capabilities from a technology perspective, but a shift in the mentality of the customer, of the end user, of how they're going to go about solving for a problem, a lot of what you need to spend your time on initially is figuring out who are the most influential and at the same time most sophisticated potential clients that understand the problem you're solving best and have spent countless hours and resources trying to solve it through more traditional and legacy means, and do everything you possibly can to educate them as to why your methodology and your solution with that methodology is better. Because you might spend months or even years convincing these absolute pillars within their industry to evolve their ideals, but once they do, they become the single most valuable change agent within their own ecosystems. And so for the first few years of our existence, we took an approach that we called our inch wide and mile deep strategy. Go in each vertical that we thought we could have a lot of success in, find a number one, number two, or number three market leading account, find the person within that account that cared the most about this topic and was the biggest skeptic of what we did, and by all means necessary, change their mind. And ultimately, we did that. And our first few clients, our first 5 clients were Fortune 100s. And that didn't happen by accident. It happened with being authentic. It happened with showing up saying, we know we're not ready to solve your problem, but we believe what we're working on will solve your problem one day. Help us get from where we are to where we're going, and then I'll ask you for money. Greater than 90% of folks that were in that early pipeline converted to clients over time.
So can you talk a little bit about, how data privacy has changed, between protecting data on-premise in a data center versus, how it happens on the cloud today?
Really only going back 4 years, so about half the time we've been alive, that was a challenge for our customers and our prospects was they thought their cloud strategy, we work with a lot of highly regulated clients, was we're not going to use the cloud. That was their cloud strategy 8 years ago, 7 years ago, 6 years ago, 5 years ago. And then all of a sudden, there was this huge momentum shift about 4 years ago where it was, we're using the cloud, whether we like it or not. Now we need to find a way to make it efficient for us to accomplish our privacy, compliance, and security goals while we're using the cloud. And that mind shift just happened. And so that's the first thing. There was an absolute mental shift maybe about 4 years ago. The difference is almost every large enterprise out there has a problem and a challenge that most startups don't face. They have existed for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and in some cases, some of our clients, 150 years. And they are an amalgamation of many different ideals over time about how their technology powers their business. Today, a startup, for all intents and purposes, wakes up and can just use AWS to do the vast majority of the blocking and tackling needed in IT, and they wouldn't even think about anything else. For a while, the mentality was, how do I secure my data on-prem? How do I secure my data on mobile? And how do I secure my data in the cloud? And ultimately, what we believe and what we've seen the market shift to is, how do I secure my data where the modality of the data doesn't influence the security outcome of the data? And where we've seen the delineation for our clients is if it has to do with the security of the infrastructure, from compute to storage to networking to in-memory to kind of API security, like application level security, the vast majority of our clients are recognizing most cloud providers do it better than they ever could. When it comes to the security, accountability, handling the appropriate use, basically, of data, that is squarely within the four walls of our clients. That's something they need to have authoritative control over, and it needs to be consistent everywhere they go. But they can now focus the aperture of their resources and their planning on getting that right in one place at their company, and allow for the cloud to provide innovative solutions in a lot of the infrastructure levels that just the scale and sheer eventing that allows for iteration in AWS is not going to be accessible to almost any enterprise in the world to get right. And so really the shift's gone from thinking about securing data on-prem or in the cloud differently to recognizing that data's data, and it's going to either be in one place or another place, but the intent of how it's handled isn't any different. But infrastructure is something that the cloud providers more often than not can just do better than most organizations can do on their own.
You know, the product or feature launch is very important, and they want to make it as useful as possible to as many customers as possible. So when should startups start to think about setting data privacy measures for the data that they collect? When, you know, almost all startups or all tech companies collect some form of data or the other today. So when should they actually, you know, start thinking about setting data privacy measures for the data that they collect?
If your customers are in any way going to come from Europe or going to come from the state of California or Massachusetts, then if you feel you're going to have any customers in any of those three places, the way that laws have shaped and are being applied, you don't really have a choice but to start thinking about it from day zero. The level of progress you need to make about being able to do sophisticated things with data privacy handling, that is something that really comes down to the level of maturity of your market and your client base. But things like the EU General Data Protection Regulation or the California or Massachusetts equivalents, they don't necessarily discriminate against the size of your company. And the thing that is going to make or break your company's ability to not be hindered by these impeding regulations and some that are already law is not necessarily how far you've gotten with how you handle data privacy. It's a lot more about this concept that most of these regulations are embodying called privacy by design or privacy by default. And what that really means is, can you articulate within your technical framework that powers your business that the data you are collecting and processing is able to only be utilized for its intended purposes? And are those intended purposes clearly articulated to the customers and individuals you're collecting the data from? How you go about doing that doesn't matter. How much of that you do on day zero doesn't matter as much. But a thought framework of, if I'm collecting data, I want to be able to provide affirmation that it's only being processed under the intended aspects of my business that I've told my customers I'm going to use it for. And if the answer is you can show that, as rudimentary as you might be able to show it, more often than not, you're doing better than most everybody else. But at the same time, you don't need to go out of your way to have Goldman Sachs level security in your MVP. The one thing we did at Ionic, we're in the business of providing high assurance technical capabilities to highly sought after data sets for our clients. We obviously didn't have the same level of capabilities we have today as we had 8 years ago. And so the thought framework we took back then was, let's prove that what we set out to do can work as an end-to-end offering. Let's go get valuable feedback from potential customers that if it was able to be delivered in a compliant way at some point in the future, that what we're offering is what they want. And we did that on a shoestring budget for all intents and purposes, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Ultimately, our first client, a very large insurance provider, came to us and said, hey, everything that you just showed us, we want. We cannot buy it until you can pass this 18-page, basically, security review process that proves this to us. And that's when we went and raised some outside capital to be able to go implement then the assurance model around the business offering. So I would say for the MVP side of it for startups, just be conscious that as you're collecting data and you're making use of it, you can account for what part of your business is making use of it, and you can articulate those things to your customers. If you can do that, and you do that from the beginning, doing it later is going to be much easier. Also, the intent will ultimately be your saving grace if you ever run afoul, even unintentionally, of one of these new regulations.
Just as a follow-up on that question, I mean, let's say that the startup has moved on and they have a proven product. Their intention is to sell into a highly regulated industry. What should they do to prep themselves so that they can have an accelerated sales cycle within those industries? Is that something that they can do?
Absolutely. There's a couple of things that can be done. The most practical, since we're sitting in this room, is Amazon itself, AWS, offers some already infrastructure validated compliant offerings, especially for regulated industries. Everything from government offerings with GovCloud to FedRAMP for a broader FedRAMP approved sections of the cloud to financial service and other kind of specifically oriented regions. And one thing that you can do, whether you're AWS bound or whether you're using another cloud provider, is not reinvent the wheel. So there's a tremendous amount of infrastructure as a service that exists in AWS and other cloud providers that solve 9 out of 10 of the infrastructure level challenges that a startup may face when they're selling into regulated markets. And 5 years ago, I couldn't have said that because people weren't on the buy side, weren't buying things running in the cloud from third parties. Today, I just left a meeting last week with a large FinServ here in New York where they flat out said that they're really not going to look at technologies that are trying to roll their own in this space anymore, just because the level of effort it takes them to validate everybody versus knowing that you're already running one of these compliant cloud offerings is just too much. It doesn't scale for them anymore with the sheer volume of vendors they're working with. And so they're driving even legacy vendors to re-implement in some of these clouds. And they're also preferring folks that have already chosen to implement in these clouds. So I think people underestimate the depth of requirements that regulated markets now have to flow down to their vendors. And just to make this practical, if you're selling into financial services and you have any aspirations of selling into the Big 10, you're going to get questionnaires that are non-binary answers and range from 1,000 to 1,600 questions that you have to prove you're compliant with before they can even buy from you, no matter how much a business unit wants to buy from you. So you can do that, or a large percentage of those questions can be solved if you run on top of the right regions inside of AWS.
Within AWS, there is something called Artifact. We have a lot of material there which you can actually use by downloading it, all the compliance frameworks for provable compliance. So if there is ever a question where you need to prove compliance, you can use Artifact, and most of those documents are sufficient to a certain degree for you to prove compliance. And then if on top of that, if you have to do something, it's probably going to be 10% of what you'd need. Most of the 90% of compliance is already covered through infrastructure security, which AWS offers. It's going to pivot the conversation into funding, right? For startups that have a bit of funding, and let's say they are at a place where they want to hire a cybersecurity expert, what should they be looking for?
First thing I would say is unpack what is a cybersecurity expert. I think it's like saying a social media expert. It is easy to state, hard to quantify. So really it would come down to once again, depending on what industries you're servicing, there may be some legitimate law that you can derive your needs from. But generally speaking, if you're going to make a hire and you're going to bring somebody onto your team whose responsibility it is to coordinate and account for and drive your business's objectives against all the right things that that word means to you, then really what you're looking for is either of somebody on your engineering team that is going to own the responsibility and have agency to achieve the outcomes that responsibility is associated with, for security engineering, making sure that you have all the right processes in place in the SDLC to ensure that you can attest to the validity and compliance of the services and infrastructure you're providing your customers. That's on one side. On the other side, it is if you feel that you are going to be handling data that is of a meaningful level of regulated kind of propensity, you need to hire an internal CISO, because it's not just about the security of your application anymore. It's about how the entire business handles its interaction with your client's data. They still want to do an independent validation of the end-to-end business and its interaction with their data, not just its technology. And so if you're really going to take this seriously, the first thing that you can do is make sure that the culture of your business is one that's aware of these things, that is willing to make every single person at the company at least a cognitive participant in making sure that the company has good security hygiene. And you just need to weigh whether you're going to get a bigger bang for your buck from having somebody focused on the end-to-end business first or focused on the actual technology offering of the business first. But it'll probably be one of those two, a security engineering lead or a overall business information security lead.
What do startups need to know about GDPR?
The first thing startups need to know about GDPR is it is an indeterminate framework. There are many, 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 many different open-ended aspects of the framework. Most of them come back down to intent, which is obviously kind of a gray area. But what you should know is that European regulators are taking this very seriously. It's been less than a year, and there's been already over 60,000 registered GDPR infractions in less than a year. There have been small companies and large companies alike hit with this framework. There was a small 300-person hospital in Portugal, apparently, that has actually been fined. It was about $400,000. That's a small business, right? And it's not a startup, but it's a small business. And so it's a challenge. You should not ignore it. If you think you can ignore it now, you're buying time. You're not solving for anything. But at the same time, I think I'd go back to a few questions ago. If you can show that your business's intent is to handle data appropriately and account for the handling of data, no matter how well you do it, if you can really show that that's a fundamental part of the design process of how you are moving your business forward, that's what most of these regulations are trying to encourage, is this concept of more of a privacy by design, appropriate use of data. And regardless of what that means for your customers, just saying this is what you're going to do and proving that that's the only thing that you're doing is what matters most. And the earlier that's part of your decision-making framework, the better. I would say that it's really that. That's probably what you should care more about. You should also recognize, though, there are many of these frameworks coming and often conflicting. And so I wish I could tell you, go look here, definitive guide to any of these things. The answer is there's a lot of case law that's going to have to get developed over the next 3 to 5 plus years before there's enough precedent for anybody with certainty to tell you, if you do X, there will be Y or Z consequences depending on how you do it. We're just not there yet. It's such a fresh mentality.
As Bitcoin has emerged and blockchain technology has emerged, a lot of startups are working with payments, cryptocurrency, all that cool stuff. So, question here is, if you look at cyber criminals, they carried out a number of successful attacks against major companies. So for new startups weighing options, right, the AWS cloud offers various security tools that makes it easier for startups to be secure and still continue to innovate. So what do you think? How should startups leverage AWS services?
AWS has a lot of services and ships a lot more almost every day, it seems. Would look at two things as a startup, leveraging Amazon services or any other cloud provider services. One is anywhere that the core infrastructure makes economical sense for your business, whether it's storage or compute or analytics or networking, uh, do not go reinvent those. Unless you have an explicit need to do that, and there are some cases where that does make sense. They're few and far between these days, but they still do make sense. Unless you have just absolute conviction from your customer base that you need to do that, use an infrastructure provider as a service like Amazon. And so for IaaS, anything that makes economical sense for you to use with IaaS, use an AWS or an AWS equivalent. When you get up the stack a little in the kind of higher order value, you need to determine whether or not binding yourself with, take something like Kinesis. That is more tailored. And if you start building everything against Kinesis, there's switching costs if down the road you have a client that says, I need those capabilities, but for whatever reason, I can't use them while they're in Amazon. That as a startup, you need to figure that out. Those are great problems to have. And so once again, if you are in the early stages of your business, what you're trying to prove to your market is that you have sufficiently increased the value of some business process or business outcome that you cannot get without using what you've invented. And the sooner you can get to that point, the sooner you can validate your business and make the determination whether or not it's better to just go all in on things like a Kinesis or something like that, or to reinvent your own. And I'd venture to say more often than not, the reinvent your own is going to be an obvious choice that you're going to realize you shouldn't make. And so I would really look at that. I mean, the security team at Amazon that focuses on AWS in particular is measured in many thousands of full-time professionals that are looking at the event stream of many millions of individual entities on the platform as businesses every single day. Nobody's perfect, but they take it so incredibly seriously. We obviously have a lot of views of all this that I can't really talk about here. We do a lot of collaborative work with AWS, but they take it more seriously than some of the biggest enterprises we've come into contact with, and you get to benefit from that every day. So from a security perspective, I just can't stress enough that if you don't need, with absolute certainty, to have your own storage, compute, analysis, networking infrastructure, you will get so much value, not just in ease of operation, ease of management, but also in the security side of your business from using something like an AWS. I mean, it's just painfully obvious now.
There's a lot of fragmented network environments, and many companies have deployed siloed security solutions in their infrastructure that require individual management. What do you think are the risks to this approach?
So the risk to a siloed infrastructure-centric security model is one that comes up often and is kind of front and center of a lot of our conversations with clients. The first thing we normally do is step back and say, yes, having your security apparatus distributed amongst different technologies, different architectures, and different operators provides a form of security. No single point of kind of security failure. In practice, though, getting off the theory of distributed models like that, in practice, the reality is you have so many different things managed by so many different people that were implemented for so many different reasons over so many periods of time that none of it's cohesive. Therefore, there's a lot of gaps that are not apparent. And that model ends up leading to more problems than it does solutions. And what we've found a lot of organizations moving to are these security platforms as a service models, even internally. One client that we work with, they have over 5,000 line of business applications. And when we got there, they had over 500 different ways of generating, storing, and reproducing key material for those applications. Well, the needs of the business to generate, store, and reproduce key material is consistent. There were 500 different implementations of how to do it. That by itself is a big problem, right? And so that approach is something that's kind of remnants of a world where you used to own the compute, you used to own the storage, you used to own the networking. There used to be a very siloed group of users that would connect into all of that, and you would just draw a ring around it and do a really good job of accounting for what happened inside and do your best to keep things from the outside from getting in. And that's just this perimeter-centric model that worked okay when you got it right, when you owned everything. We just don't live in that world anymore. And no matter how much we want to drag that ideal along, It was never designed to operate in today's world of many users, many devices, many providers. Where things are really going on this topic is to get away from the idea that you can have a ring fence around all of your problems. What you need to do is be able to account for a model that you can bring consistency to all the places your information may end up. And you need to be able to do that in collaboration with many different providers of infrastructure that may need to possess your information. Think about 15 years when multi-tenant applications started to really take off in enterprise. One of the biggest challenges that prevented that model from scaling 15 years ago was that enterprises had to figure out how to bring their user populations to each and every one of those applications, because the user object model and the identity model and the authentication model were proprietary. And so they had to re-implement this common thing, their user population, and they had to manage it in every place differently. Enterprises woke up one day and realized that no matter how much they wanted that model to be real, you just can't manage it at scale. It doesn't work. There are too many things to manage. So they inverted it, and you got the whole identity and access management world when you got these couple common protocols from SAML to OAuth, and enterprises now have a system of record. They bring their identities in a common way to all of these places that need access to a common identity. You're starting to see the same thing with data security and data accountability. The infrastructure and the application security model can be rather proprietary, but exposed through some consistent methodologies. But how an enterprise goes about accounting for their data, trusting the use of that data, and securing that data is becoming more of a system of record architecture that is being delivered just in time when data needs to be used. And we're seeing that time and time and time again at some of the largest enterprises. And I think it's a couple years out from really flowing down to the rest of the market, but it is where the largest of organizations are getting to, because they've discovered if they want to lift and shift 5,000 legacy applications to, say, AWS, but they have to manage the security model of that data in AWS different than they manage it in Salesforce, than they manage it in Box, it's not going to be manageable. It's where we see all our clients have a lot of success, and it's where we see our clients unlock a tremendous amount of momentum. It used to be they had to have a compliance team go review each and every provider's security model and then check up on it once a quarter, once a year. Now they can say if they have these common frameworks in place, they can get started, and then they can pull back things if they need to later. I mean, it's just a complete inversion of how they're approaching the problem.
Funding for security startups continue to gain the attention of venture capitalists. And can you share some best practices from Ionics' funding journey and offer tips on what new startups should be preparing for?
The funding landscape is interesting. We did kind of me working for a year and a half for free and just doing what needed to be done, to a friends and family round, to a Series A, and kind of the traditional path. Fast forward to today, we've raised a little over $150 million in equity capital and many, many tens of millions of dollars more in client dollars over the years. And what kind of has been consistent along the way is we've always had, at every junction of fundraising, investors willing to give us lower price capital, meaning they're willing to pay more on a valuation to join our business, but they had less fundamental understanding about our business and where we wanted to go. And so at every junction, we always took who we felt were the right partners for the kind of where we were as a business, where we wanted to go, to lead our financings, not necessarily the cheapest capital. And I think that's paid dividends the world over for us over the years, because what we found were investment partners that had a view of the future that could not exist without a company like ours becoming successful. So through thick and thin, they rolled up their sleeves to really help solve challenging problems all along the way, versus somebody that was, hey, we love your business. We've done a case study on the market. You're leading it. We've contacted 20 of your clients. They say nothing but great things. It's a great space. We want in. But then the moment there's a small 5-degree left or 5-degree right shift in what's going on, they freak out because they don't fundamentally understand why. And ultimately, as that became clear in the early days of Ionic, like, we bought some early investors out. from our business that became so apparent that we were the wrong fit. We just had the adult conversation and sorted it out. To now, partners like Kleiner or GV, among others, it's been nothing but what feels like an honest partnership. And that's the one thing I would say to anybody raising capital. There is a lot of capital out there. There's all types of capital out there. And actually, contrary to a lot of media on the topic, there's more capital looking for private equity opportunities than there ever has been. And so because of that, the ability to get funding for your business is more, so long as it's actually got real opportunity, is less about finding investors that want to fund it. It's about you finding the right partners at the right investment shops that absolutely get the version of the future you're trying to create. If you find each other, you will find the capital for your business. And I would always say this. I mean, we're sitting here in New York. There's a healthier VC market in New York today than there was 5 years ago. The other thing that we did is we hopped on a plane and went to California, because that's where most of the early stage, I would say, smart capital is for our business, for what we do, enterprise software, and specifically cybersecurity. And I can't tell you the number of times entrepreneurs, after we raised our Series A, stayed in Atlanta as it built our business, came up to me and say, how did you do that? Like, how did you go get Kleiner or Google to invest in the company? And our response, or my first question was, well, when was the last time you went out there and sat down with those firms? And, well, we've never gone out there. So hop on a plane. These things aren't transactional. They're relationships. Get to know each other well before you need the capital. And one last little anecdote on that. One of our investors who has helped us grow our business over the years is Meritech. When we raised our seed round, one of our seed investors, hey, you need to sit down with the partners at Meritech. They are no way going to fund your business right now, but they're genuine enough that they're going to get to know your business. And if there ever is a time they think it is good for them to get involved, they'll get involved. Well, so we, once a quarter, would meet with the partners at Meritech when we were like 5 people, then 15 people, then 50 people. And that happened for 2 years. And one day, Meritech, one of the partners, called us up and said, hey, we've been doing kind of side research. We've been really following you guys. We really appreciate the time you've given us. We suspect 6 to 9 months from now, you're going to really hit a point where you're going to need a lot of capital to go kind of to the next level of your business. If you're open to it, we'd like to work out an opportunity that makes sense for both of us now and get in front of that. And that was all for providing a space over a long arc for us to get to know each other and for them to get to know not just us as a company, but us as people. And it allowed for them to make a decision sooner than they normally would, because we were just authentically getting to know each other. So I can say it's never too early to start building those relationships, because they're just that. They're relationships. And once you've decided to get involved, say in some really small edge cases, it's very difficult to separate ways. And so you really need to feel comfortable about the human element, not just the capital element of fundraising.
So everyone loves a good war story. So what's an example of something that went really wrong in Ionics' early days? And how did the team solve it?
This is being recorded, right?
It is.
Let me figure out what our general counsel. In all seriousness, I'm a huge believer. I live my life completely this way, that success in something you set out to accomplish only reinforces the fact that what you know is accurate, and failure is the only thing that gives you new knowledge. And so we failed a lot, and we continue to fail. It's how you deal with those failures, I think, makes or breaks the outcome of you as an individual, you as a friend, or you as a business. There have been scenarios where we either felt we didn't want to be completely forthright with folks, in the sense that we were concerned about what would happen and what they would do in the early days of trying to partner. We're a startup. We're concerned people are going to try to take our stuff. And what we realized is that anybody that's actually accomplishing anything interesting with their business doesn't have time to take your ideas and run with them. If you're really doing something that's just better than what they could do on their own, it's obvious they're going to work with you. And if not, then what you're doing may not be all that interesting. And that's a reality check that you need to be willing to have with yourself. And I think there's a lot of incidents that have been inflection points for us as a business, where we had to look hard in the mirror and determine whether or not we wanted to be the reason we couldn't get to the next step, or we felt so confident that what we were doing would stand on its own merits that it didn't matter how far we went in sharing what we were up to and what our plans were, that if we really were doing those things as well as we thought, partnerships like working with Amazon, and now we have official partnerships with Microsoft and Google, we're the only security company that has all three, would come. That was a self-realization that took a while to get comfortable with. And I think anytime we didn't do that, we failed. And anytime that we were authentic, we may not have got what we wanted, but we understood why with clarity.
We're going to kind of move on to some questions from the audience here. Okay. How much insight should one share with their potential customers about their internal security systems prior to taking them on as a customer?
100% insight. There is no security team worth their salt that will ever chide you for being 100% transparent. I think any security team that's worth their salt cares more about the fact that you as a business and you as people are always telling them the complete truth. And if they really want what you have, most security teams these days at large enterprises have a mindset that is, we know you're not going to meet what we expect you to be able to achieve for us here. But we want clarity and complete understanding of what the gap is so we can bound the risk today of getting started with you and then help you get to where we want you to be over time. I don't know if I want to call it a fallacy, but it's one thing that I've seen. I've got half dozen investments in some small startups. And one thing they've asked me all the time is like, hey, we don't really have this ready just yet, or we don't really have that. Like, how should we really respond to this? I'm like, tell them that. And then ask them what they want to do about it. Any security team that fires you from the pipeline of deals because you told them the truth, that's a client you don't want right now anyway. We've had the great fortune to earn the trust and ability to service some amazing clients all over the world, small and large, and never once did we feel that oversharing got us in trouble. If anything, it got us further faster.
What do you think about hiring an ethical hacker to dig into your infrastructure prior to launch?
So we are in the business of building secure, high assurance data trust technologies, from cryptography to key management to policy to accountability. And our systems sit in front of every important write of information inside of a business and every important read thereafter. So our stuff functioning, not just from a security perspective, but also from a durability and resiliency perspective, is pretty tantamount to success for our clients. So we actually, even though we have a lot of amazing experts on staff that have spent their life studying these problems in practice, we have, I don't know, a half dozen or so outside firms that we work with on a constant basis to continue to validate a lot of the things we believe to be true about our own offerings. At any stage where you feel you're going to assert claims about your security posture, there's no downside in having some independent firm whose business it is to validate these claims at scale to come in and reality check you. But you should also not look at it as a certificate of, I'm done. It's ongoing. And so one thing that we do is we have firms that specialize from actually doing applied testing. They take our code in a black box form and do everything they can from the outside in. Then we have firms where we give them the code, we give them the architecture and say, cool, have at it, and kind of then converge those outcomes. There's a whole crop of companies out there now that are making it economical and almost systematic to do this. And so there's companies like Synac, former NSA, Red Team folks that do this as a service, but instead of being a firm of 20 really smart folks trying to spread themselves an inch kind of deep, but a mile wide, what Synac's gone out and done is said, hey, we've got 10,000 plus kind of security researchers that are full-time employed at places like Google or Facebook or other places that want to moonlight as pen testers. But their specialty, their domain expertise is memory corruption in Hadoop clusters for transaction volumes over 1,000 QPS. Like that level of specificity. And so you happen to come to them with a project and they recognize that the scope of your project falls into that. They have the exact expert that'll come in for 4 hours to just test that one thing. What Synac does as a company makes it ridiculously easy for even a small company of 5 people to get an outcome like that in an economical way. And there's dozens of other companies out there like that. But that's how you should think about it. You should think about it as an ongoing process, as a good part of hygiene. It's like going to get your physical. There's no downside. And then it's now economical to do it in bite sizes. So it's something more startups should consider more frequently.
So the next one I have here for you is, with The global economic climate changing and the way we handle payments are changing, like face pay and other mechanisms such as Apple Pay and other in-kiosk payment methods. Where do you see new security going with transactions, financial transactions?
Security with financial transactions. There's kind of three parts of that. There's the end user security. Is the information I'm sharing with this vendor going to remain safe and only be used for appropriate things? So I'm concerned about fraud when I swipe my card or what have you. Then there is the processors themselves. And then there are all the squishy points in between, the business I'm transacting with. Where the future of that's going is going down two very divergent paths, and time will tell which one wins, and they both probably will survive, in my opinion. One is payments as a service is becoming a bigger and bigger business. And you look at companies like Stripe, anybody that can defer and shift the complexity of the end-to-end payment model and still run their business is going to. And it just makes complete sense to do that. The other divergent path is this concept of distributing payments. So it's not a real-time processing of payments between an institution and a receiver. It's something like a value store that has the ability to be drawn down against. And you're seeing a lot of that with blockchain-enabled payment systems, vaulting technologies, and things like that. Even the Intercontinental Exchange, an Atlanta company that owns the New York Stock Exchange, they just launched a blockchain walleting system that's based off of vaulting technology where instead of there being actual transactions settled on the blockchain, because that's inefficient for a lot of things at high scale and high frequency, they're just backing all the transaction with a value store. And they're taking the risk of those things eventually settling. And you're going to see, I think, some more of that, where there really isn't a financial transaction between the parties. It appears there is, but there never was. If we can find a way to, as a society, to get away from having to do an end-to-end payment transaction for every little payment, the world of microtransactions to allow for us to accomplish spending things to get value at scale, or get away from these ideals of you need to buy enough of something for it to make economical sense, I think are going to go away. Right now, it's just the cost to settle is preventing those business models from succeeding. And that's one thing blockchain has the potential. Time will tell if it's able to be delivered at scale.
We have a team of three running lean, as almost all startups are. How important is it for us to consider hiring a contractor, or is this something we can own ourselves?
The likelihood that you can find the one right, perfect security engineer that can do everything you need from the implementation side to the operational side to the architectural side to the ability to represent that to your clients is low. And so the areas that you probably can focus on is working now with these kind of outside on-demand firms like a Synac to do it on a project-by-project basis. And what you should focus on, either hiring or acquiring amongst your own three-person team today, the skills to do, is to clearly be able to do the security and threat modeling of what you have as a business and be able to clearly articulate that model to your customers. And then be able to have outside validation of that. Let's just say that you wanted to hire one really well-qualified, capable security engineer that's good at half of what you need. You're going to spend 150 to 200K. You're not going to spend anywhere close to that in a year's worth of projects with a Synac or a Denim. Yet you're going to get the kind of crowdsourced brain trust that they can bring to bear for now. So I do think if you're really at that stage and you're going to stay lean for a while, it just 5 years ago, these things didn't exist. They do now. Make use of them as a service until you realize that the need to deliver innovation in the security of what you're doing is now what needs to come next. That's when you need to start thinking about hiring on the full-time talent to do it. But what you would be better served by is bringing on a team member or acquiring the skills yourselves to coordinate all that outside help and then be able to stand tall and represent the outcomes of all of that to your clients in the conversations. And I think one big part of that is just having a really strong and complete awareness of your security posture, your threat model, and your ability to articulate those things to your customers. That will go a very, very long way.
What are your thoughts on the future of data security in the cloud for startups?
First, I would shorten the sentence with just as what's the future of data security? Whether it's cloud or whether it's on-prem, whether it's mobile, we have got to stop thinking about the data security and ultimately the trust of how the data is handled differently just because it's in a different place. The data is the same. And we have to stop thinking about the embodiment of the data any differently. Just because it's currently a structured data set sitting inside of a cockroach DB cluster, and all of a sudden it's exported into a CSV report that then gets converted to a PDF, from the business's perspective, the information is the same. We got to stop thinking about how we secure and account for those things differently. I think that's half the problem, is we're trying to tailor solutions to these different things when really the needs are the same. And so the future is the separation of data security from application security, from infrastructure security, is going to become clearer and clearer and clearer. And similar to how identity is now a just-in-time capability that is standardized in its delivery from a system of record for the custodian of those identities, you're going to see similar things start to emerge in data security. Or it just won't scale. It won't work. The kind of model I liken it to is it's got to become a utility. The difference between like an authorized .NET 20 years ago to a Stripe today. They're doing basically the same thing, except Stripe's made it an order of magnitude easier and an order of magnitude more efficient for anybody to be a world-class payment processor. Twilio's done the same thing for mobile messaging. Things like Okta are doing the same thing for identity. Ionic and others are doing the same thing for data security. The future is really allowing developers and business owners to focus on being world-class at what they do best and be able to tap into world-class capabilities as a service in areas that are necessary, but they don't themselves need to be world-class at.
Thank you, Adam, for joining us in this conversation, and hope you all enjoyed the conversation and got something useful. Thank you.
Appreciate it.